Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology. I am David Leitner. I'm your instructor for this term. And today we're going to talk about what culture actually is. How do we define it? Since this is a thing anthropologists study, it's a good idea to know what it is, right? So we're going to talk about that and a little bit about sort of how it is we sort of come to study it. There we go. So, how do we define culture? Well, that's a deceptively simple question. I'm going to give you two different definitions from two different anthropologists from two different centuries to kind of address this. The fact of the matter is, if you open any anthropology textbook, you're going to have a slightly different definition of culture. But all of those definitions share a number of things in common. So on the left here, we've got E.B. Tyler from 1871. And this is from one of the first textbooks on anthropology ever. And his definition of culture is culture taken in its wide ethnographic sense is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Luke Eric Lasseter, more than a century later, says that culture is, in an anthropological sense, is a shared and negotiated system of meaning informed by knowledge that people learn and put into practice by interpreting experience and generating behavior. Now, those sound very different on the surface, but I want to point out some similarities here. Both of them agree that there's something complex and interconnected about culture. It is a system. It is a complex whole. Both of them agree that it has something to do with what people know, and that they acquire this during their lifetime. You have to learn it. You aren't born with your culture already inside of you. Think of it this way. Language is part of culture. All of us have an innate capacity to acquire language and to learn languages, but you are not born knowing all the rules of your language, right? So just because somebody has two parents who are from Mexico who speak Mexican Spanish doesn't mean that they will automatically speak that language, okay? That's common sense, right? But that's what we mean by acquired. Culture is not something we are inborn with. In addition to knowledge and learning, it also has to do with practice and habits. So it's not just what you think, it's what you do as well. We'll find out that in anthropology, there's a real sort of emphasis on the difference between these two, and that they are interconnected, but not in the ways that you think. A lot of us think most of the time that thought leads to action, but sometimes actions lead to thoughts, believe it or not. Finally, it is shared and negotiated. There's something social about this. Man as a member of society. Obviously, the problematic use of man there, we'll excuse it for now because of the time he was writing in, but the idea is the same, that human beings are not just individuals, they are parts of a larger whole. And culture is part of that. That is where culture lives, in the space between people. And although we share all of this knowledge, all of these beliefs, art, morals, blah, 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 we also don't always agree on it. I'm going to go into more detail on these in a minute, but the last one I want to point out, one that Tyler didn't necessarily emphasize, but Lasseter, and I think most anthropologists would agree now, is that there's a cognitive element to culture as well. It plays a role in how we interpret our experiences and thus what behaviors are generated from those experiences. It gives us tools with which to interact with the world. Okay, so just to summarize, my definition is that culture is a complex system. It is shared and negotiated. It is symbolic and practiced. It is acquired, or rather learned, which means it has something to do with knowledge, but it also has to do with habits, and it mediates our experience and our actions. Finally, and this is something all anthropologists will agree with, it is adaptive and it is always changing. It is never standing still. In other words, culture isn't a list of things. It is a process by which human beings get by in the world and live together in groups. A couple of metaphors. Sometimes anthropologists talk about culture as a toolbox. Okay, a toolbox lets you do things, but no two cultures would have the same toolbox. Is the idea. Some toolboxes have hammers, others don't. They have different things. Everybody has the right tools for getting the things done in their society. But just because you don't have a hammer doesn't mean you can't drive a nail with something else, like the flat end of a wrench. Right? There's more than one way to do things, is my point. There are some limits to this model, because culture is simultaneously enabling, like the toolbox, but it's also constraining. And maybe actually this is a feature of the model. You know, you've only got the tools you've got. But it is also adaptive and always changing. We're changing out those tools constantly and adapting them. Also, culture isn't perfectly adapted. It's very rare you'll find an actual hammer in there. It's usually something pieced together from other tools. And finally, culture is not just a list of tools. It's a process and an interconnected system. All those tools have something to do with one another. In other words, culture is holistic. Another metaphor, one you'll hear me use quite a bit, is that culture is a lens. It changes the way we see the world. It changes the way we experience it. It distorts and shapes how we actually view the world, and it focuses on some parts of the picture while obscuring others. So, you know, the field of focus might be very narrow or very broad. It just depends. And most importantly, if we try hard enough, we can actually change our lenses sometimes. And this is an essential thing for anthropologists trying to avoid ethnocentrism. Of course, culture isn't just how we see the world. It's how we react to it as well. People looking through the same lens can see different things, and no two individuals have identical lenses. Now I want to come to the definition in our textbook. Welsh and Vivanco say culture is learned. It uses symbols. It is dynamic, always adapting and changing. It is integrated with daily experience. It shapes everybody's life. It is shared. And cultural understanding involves overcoming ethnocentrism. I think you can see some familiar things in that. There are some commonalities here. So let's go through their definition and talk about what they mean. Culture is learned. Culture is not something we're born with. It is something we acquire from early on in our life. In fact, actually, our brains seem perfectly adapted to acquiring culture. I want to make that different. I want to make that clear. Our brains evolved to acquire culture. So there is a biological component here, an evolutionary component, but it's not the cultures themselves. It is our capacity to use culture and to acquire it that we are born with. From that point on, it's everything you experience in every person around you from the moment you're born, even sometimes before you're born. This process of acquiring culture is known as enculturation, and it goes on for your entire life. It can begin even before we're born. There's some evidence that fetuses, after they're born, have taste preferences related to the things mothers were eating when they were in the womb. Sometimes enculturation is very explicit, like learning to read, learning to do math, that sort of thing. But most of the time it's tacit. What position do you sleep in? Are you more comfortable with a pillow or not a pillow? Does your society use pillows? Do you sleep on a hard surface, or do you sleep on a very soft mattress? What are your favorite foods? What kind of clothing do you wear? How is your language? How does your language work? Body language, right? And I'm not talking, when I talk about learning language, I'm not talking about the grammar. I'm talking about all the little ways you talk that are like the ways your parents talk and the ways your friends talk. Where did you get that? You didn't get that in school. You got that without realizing it. This enculturation is most intense during childhood, but it continues throughout life. Culture is symbolic. It involves symbols constantly, whether we're talking about language or talking about other things. Symbols are an important way about how the brain processes, interprets, and reacts to culture. Symbols are simply things that by convention stand for other things. They can be anything. They can be images, they can be sounds, they can be colors, they can be smells. Anything can be a symbol, okay? And symbols are extremely powerful. I sometimes do an exercise where I ask students to draw, make two drawings. One is just a circle, and the other is, I walk them through the steps. I never tell them it's the American flag, but it's clear when you're done that you've got an upside down American flag. And then I tell them to tear up each one. And students had no problem tearing up the circle, even though I tell them that's the Japanese flag. They have no problem tearing it up. When it comes to the one that looks kind of like the Stars and Stripes, a lot of students stop for a second before doing so. Some students outright refuse, and that's great. That's fine. That's part of my point. This is a powerful, powerful symbol for Americans, but there isn't agreement on what it really stands for. Okay? It means very different things to different Americans, and that's a good thing. That's what we mean by the fact that culture is shared and negotiated. What kind of democracy, when we talk about some of the words that come up around the flag are democracy, freedom, equality. Well, what kind of democracy are we talking about? There are lots of different democracies in the world. The American one isn't the only one. Freedom. Well, freedom for whom and to do what? The mass debates are a great example of this. Where are the lines between individual freedoms and the rights of larger groups? Equality. What does equality mean? Anyways, some people feel like it stands for war, and it stands for imperialism. Some people think it stands for capitalism, either in a good way or a bad way. Those are all valid meanings to draw from this symbol, but it is a symbol nonetheless. And it is a symbol that's so powerful that even when you have a scribbled drawing with the wrong number of stripes, no colors, and the wrong number of stars, you still treat it like it's the flag. It's an interesting thing. So, the thing about symbols is you have to be able to decode them, but to decode them, you also have to really understand them in the first place. It is something we do automatically. It's subconscious. These things barely rise to the surface of your awareness. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz gives the example of a wink. Okay, how do you know when someone winks if that was a wink or if they just twitched? What's the difference? Well, a wink is a culturally specific symbol. It has meaning for the winker. It has meaning for the person who's seeing the wink. And if those are only going to match if they both know what the intention of that wink was and what a wink means in general, and that it's not a twitch. Those are all signals that are kind of automatic. We don't think about it, all right? To decode a wink, you have to make lots of judgments in a split second. Was this intentional? What is the intention? Should I respond to it? How should I respond to it? All of this, comes up at once, and it barely rises into your awareness at all. That's because that's how culture works. Culture is a shorthand. It allows you to skip all of those thoughts because you know the answers already. You don't even think about the questions. That doesn't mean culture is always perfect and that culture is transmitted always perfectly, but it means that it works often enough to give us a great advantage in the world. Think about it for a second. All other ape species over the last 6 million years have been dying off. We're down to just us and four other great apes. That's it. And unlike the other species of great apes, we're the only one flourishing. That is entirely due to culture, and has been due to culture during this entire period. Culture is dynamic. Culture adapts. This is why it allowed us to survive during a period of geologically significant climate change. Nothing on the scale that we're seeing now, but still very significant in terms of evolution. That world was always changing, and culture adapts. In fact, culture has the advantage over biological evolution because it can adapt within an individual's lifetime. It can adapt in a moment. You don't have to wait for mutations to arise. So culture is an extremely efficient way of adapting behaviors to a changing environment and changing needs. Culture is also negotiated. As I pointed out before, this flag means different things to different people. It's in that process of negotiation that new meanings, new agreed upon meanings come out. And that constant dynamic of change and negotiation is always going on. Some changes are adaptive. Others are not as clearly adaptive, and they may be adaptive to things that aren't obvious at the moment. Why fashion? Fashion changes constantly, and has for hundreds of years in the West, and changed for most of the past century on an almost annual basis. Decorations on gravestones change periodically over time. The fashion of what is to be put on gravestones in graveyards changes. And that's because culture is a complex process. Those tastes and style, those are all probably related to other changes in culture that are also going on. Finally, culture is integrated into daily experience. It seems natural. It is deeply, deeply integrated into our behaviors, beliefs, and values. And our cultural beliefs and patterns often seem to be the only reasonable way to do things, or to think about things. That can be what food to eat, how to sleep, clothing, hairstyle, parenting. And it's only by taking a cross-cultural perspective that you can see how these aren't natural, actually. How they are culturally dependent. That it's part of the acquired knowledge and way of thinking that we have. So that means culture is both shared and it is constructed. Our assumptions about the way the world works are all culturally constructed. But what does cultural construction mean? A cultural construction is simply a thing that exists because everybody acts as if it does. Okay? Laws are culturally constructed. That doesn't mean they're make-believe, does it? You walk out into the street right now and hit somebody over the head, they're probably going to call the cops on you, or worse, but there are going to be legal consequences in addition to anything else that happens, right? Those consequences are real. You will experience them. You are not imagining them. But the law that caused those things only exists because we all agreed to do it. If we all stopped agreeing on it, we wouldn't do it anymore. That is the crazy thing about cultural constructions. They are not make-believe, but they depend on everybody's agreement or assent in order to work. And the kinds of cultural constructions I'm talking about are the way that are people's assumptions about what's proper and improper, what is right and wrong, the way the world works, how the sun rises and sets. All of these things are cultural constructions. Now, we're not just limited to those kinds of beliefs. We're limited to things like, cultural constructions expand into things like ideas about gender, about sexuality, about what a family is and what counts as a family, who counts as a relative and who doesn't, what is a marriage. It extends to our ideas about religion, about diet, all of these things. Examining the cultural constructions of other societies in this class is going to allow us to also examine our own assumptions, our own cultural constructions, and look at those a little more critically, I hope. Culture shapes everybody's life. As I mentioned, enculturation starts early. We reinforce enculturation every time we interact with another person or another social construct in our culture. Whether we're reading a book, watching a movie, listening to music, walking down the street, culture is getting reinforced in us in one way or another. Explicit forms of culture like enforcing norms occurs. Implicit ways of enforcing culture like the ideologies we have embedded in our language, the ways we use language, gender, the use of gender in language, for instance. Culture is shared, and it's shared because culture requires cooperation. As I mentioned, it's our key adaptive trait in evolution, and that is because, unlike the other great apes, we were able to cooperate in very complex ways that allowed us not only to access new forms of food during a time when ecosystems were being changed very rapidly, we could also enter entirely new environments, like cold environments, mountainous environments, and adapt to them using clothing, tools, fire, that sort of thing. The evolution of our brains was largely driven by the need to adapt to larger social groups. It takes a lot of mental processing and cognitive space to keep track of what everybody is thinking and doing, so that you can better strategize how to react to things and how to react to people. And you can't have culture on your own. All right? Our brains are entirely dependent on other people. We are centered around other humans, no matter how solo we feel like we are. In the absence of other human beings, our brains cease functioning properly. We develop, we can develop hallucinations. We can develop depression, anxiety, other forms of mental illness. Being alone is not good, as many people have discovered over the past year and a half. But additionally, we don't just have to look to that. Language itself evolved most likely because of gossip and the need to gossip. I don't necessarily mean gossip, but the need to talk about other people. And one of the things anthropologist Robin Dunbar has witnessed is that something like 2/3 of all conversations that they've observed around the world are about people who aren't in the conversation. Right? That's significant. That's very significant. That is how much we talk about other people, because that is how we evolved. We are social beings. So finally, then, what is culture? All of these things are connected in culture. These features are intertwined. The elements of culture are always connected in complex ways. It's everywhere you go. It's in everything you do. I'm showing you a picture of, I'm not a sushi expert. I think it's a California roll. ish. Anyways, there's a lot going on here from a cultural point of view. It's based on a traditional Japanese food that, starting in the 1960s, began to spread around the world. In the 1980s in the United States, it gained a huge popularity as kind of a status food for people to for people who had money to sort of show off that they had money, because it was still relatively rare. We can examine this from lots of different angles in anthropology. We can look at the evolution of globalization. Sushi is part of that story. We can talk about the economics of it. Sushi, the cost of sushi itself, the size of the industry, the fact that it was a status food. We can talk about tastes in food. Americans before about 20 or 30 years ago would never think of eating raw fish. Are you kidding? That's disgusting. You'll get sick. That was a typical American reaction. Well, things have changed. There's culture change going on. The inclusion of avocados into this Japanese cuisine. Avocados are not a traditional Japanese ingredient. This is largely a California contribution here. So again, we're looking at cultural change and globalization. Environment. The sushi industry is responsible for depleting many fishing stocks across the globe. And in some cases, fish caught in the Atlantic will be stuck on airplanes and flown to Japan to be as fresh as possible when it arrives. That's a lot of greenhouse gases. So there's an environmental impact that we can examine here as well. So all of these things come together in terms of culture. Sushi is always changing. Our food tastes are adapting. It has symbolic significance as a status food. It has a different status and different symbolism in Japan. It is an economic asset that people trade on. All of these things come together in this one object. That's culture. That's anthropology. Thanks again for joining me. I hope you are all doing well. Stay safe, and I will see you again soon.